Hello again, and welcome to Astronomy Toronto. My name is Randy Attwood, and I'm currently the president of the Toronto Centre of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. Well, this is Astronomy Toronto's 5th year on Rogers Cable 10, and we're starting this year with not only a new set behind me here, thanks to Jillian Buriak, but also with a lineup of some very interesting programs in the next year. A year from now, Halley's Comet is going to be visible in our skies. We'll be looking at that, and also Voyager 2 will be passing the planet Uranus. So that should be very interesting, and you'll want to stay tuned with that. Closer to home, the David Dunlap Observatory of the University of Toronto is celebrating its 50th anniversary in 1985, so we'll be visiting there. Well, on the past November 23rd, a total solar eclipse took place, not in North America, but in Papua New Guinea. Well, in the past 6 years, there have been 6 eclipses that members of the Toronto Centre of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada have visited. They're very rare. We had clear skies and we saw this one. And with me to describe total solar eclipses and what we saw is Michael Watson. Michael is a member of the Toronto Centre and has in the past been director of 2 of the expeditions to see eclipses. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Randy.
Well, Michael, let's start from the beginning and tell me what we're talking about when we talk about an eclipse of the sun.
Well, an eclipse of the sun is quite simple to describe. It occurs at new moon when the moon passes directly between the sun and the earth, so that an observer on the surface of the earth sees the moon block out the bright surface of the sun.
All right, we have a slide, Michael, that shows this, the sun, moon, and earth, in a perfectly straight line. And when we see this, we'll find that there are 2 shadows of the moon falling upon the earth.
That's right. We see the sun on the left, the moon in the middle, and the earth on the right. And we see that the moon is casting a dark shadow on the earth, and we see that there's an inner dark shadow called the umbra and a lighter, paler shadow called the penumbra. An observer located at the apex of that dark shadow would see a total eclipse of the sun, and an observer located within the lighter shadow would see a partial eclipse of the sun.
Well, in the next shot, we'll see somebody standing in that shadow, and there are 3 types of eclipses of the sun, aren't there?
There are 3 types of eclipses of the sun. The first one that we're seeing here is a photograph of a partial eclipse of the sun. That occurs when the moon doesn't pass centrally across the sun, but obscures at maximum eclipse only a portion of the sun. That's the first type of eclipse. The second type of eclipse is what is called an annular eclipse. And during an annular eclipse, the moon passes centrally directly across the sun, but the moon is located at that portion of its orbit where it is further away than usual. The result is that for an observer located on the Earth, the moon appears smaller in size than the sun, and at maximum eclipse, the moon cannot cover completely the very bright surface of the sun. The observer then sees a narrow, brilliant annulus, or ring of sunlight, dazzlingly bright, left around the darkened disk of the moon, and that is called an annular eclipse. This is a photograph of an annular eclipse taken with a dense solar filter through a telescope. The third type of eclipse, and it's really this type of eclipse that we travel long distances to see, are the so-called total eclipses of the sun. Now, a total eclipse of the sun, a photograph of which you see here, is also a central eclipse in that the moon passes centrally across the sun's disk. During a total eclipse, the moon is at that portion of its orbit where it is closer to the Earth, and it therefore appears large enough to cover completely the very bright surface of the sun. It then exposes the outer corona, the very faint atmosphere of the sun, and we'll be seeing photographs and we'll be describing the corona a little later. So those are the 3 types of eclipses.
And the totality is certainly the most spectacular. How long can totality last?
The total phase of a total eclipse of the sun can last at the most for any eclipse approximately 7 minutes and 20 seconds. For most eclipses, totality is much shorter, on the order of 1 minute, 2 minutes, or 3 minutes in length.
Now, for one spot on the Earth, how long would one, say, have to wait to see from one total eclipse to the other?
Well, let's say you happen to be living in Toronto and you saw one total eclipse of the sun. On the average, mathematically, you would have to wait 350 years until you saw the next one from Toronto. And it's because of this that we have to travel great distances to see eclipses on a regular basis.
And these, of course, are all predicted well in advance, just mathematically, too.
Absolutely. Hundreds and indeed thousands of years they can be predicted.
What's the difference between a lunar eclipse and a solar eclipse, Michael?
An eclipse of the moon differs from an eclipse of the sun in that it is not the sun that disappears, but rather the moon. And it disappears by a different mechanism. The moon actually at full moon passes into the shadow which is cast by the Earth and therefore gradually becomes invisible. One of the other features of a lunar eclipse that is different from a solar eclipse is that a lunar eclipse is visible for any observer for whom the moon is above the horizon. That means that observers on half the world or half the Earth can see a lunar eclipse, whereas with a total solar eclipse one must travel great distances to see them because they can be seen only within a very narrow path, only a few hundred kilometers wide.
So our watchers tonight will probably have had a chance to see a lunar eclipse because they're much easier to see.
Well, they are. They're much more frequent for any observer, and indeed you can see 2 or 3 from any city in any location on the Earth in every decade.
All right, so a solar eclipse occurs at new moon, and then 2 weeks later you have full moon where you have a lunar eclipse. Well, why don't we get one of each every month as the moon's going around the Earth?
Well, that's a good question, and one would think that one would get a solar eclipse and a lunar eclipse every month, and so you'd have 12 of them every year. The reason that you don't is that the moon in its orbit around the Earth does not revolve in the same orbit as the sun and the Earth. Rather, its orbit is inclined, as we call it, or tilted slightly, so that at most new moons and at most full moons, the moon passes to the north or to the south of the line joining the sun and the Earth, or in effect above or below that line, and therefore misses completely the shadow of the Earth for a lunar eclipse, and its shadow misses the Earth for a solar eclipse. It is only twice in every year during the so-called eclipse seasons that the new moon and full moon coincide with the position where the moon is directly in the exact same line as the sun and the moon, and the Earth rather, and therefore that eclipses can occur.
So in 1984, the months are May and November, and Toronto experienced an eclipse in May, and we saw this eclipse in November. Well, let's take a look at our sun, because the sun is a very interesting object. As we all know, the sun is the closest star to Earth, and it's a gaseous star. It's a yellow type star. You may not think of the sun as yellow. But we have a slide here, Michael, that shows some of the more interesting parts that we can see of the sun.
What we see in the middle is the yellowish bright disk of the sun. This is a painting of the various portions of the sun. We call that the photosphere, and it is the brilliant part of the sun that we see every day in the sky. We see on the sun there several dark spots, which are in fact sunspots. Those sunspots can be seen only with a filter on a telescope, and they're actually magnetic storms on the surface of the sun. On the edges of the sun, we see the so-called pink prominences, which are actually clouds of gas in the atmosphere of the sun condensing and falling down on the surface of the sun. And then finally on the right side we see what we call the corona, which means crown, and it is the very faint outer atmosphere of the sun, which can be seen only either in specialized instruments or during a total eclipse of the sun. And it's that we really go to see during a total eclipse.
And the prominences in the corona are much too faint to see in the daytime. The photosphere is just too bright. You can see these objects from space, and the next slide shows a slide taken from Skylab, which is or was in Earth orbit, and it's a shot of some of the surface of the sun and some of the prominences coming up off of it.
Well, this is a view, of course, that you can never get from the Earth, and it's very fortunate indeed for astronauts to be able to get this kind of view of the sun. Solar observation is very good from space.
All right, Michael, now I'm sure everyone listening and watching tonight is aware of the dangers of watching an eclipse. A partial eclipse, the sun is still very, very bright. You've got to take care. And we have a piece of a partial eclipse observing hardware, and maybe you can explain why one uses a welder's glass.
Well, the problem with observing the sun or observing a partial eclipse of the sun is that, as you say, the sun is very brilliant, and if you concentrate and look at the partially eclipsed image of the sun for even as short a period of time as 30 seconds, you can seriously damage your eye. You can use a filter, however, to filter out the harmful rays of the sun, and a filter can be as little as a small piece of number 14 welder's glass that you can buy at any welder's supply shop for a few dollars.
Yeah.
That's right. And simply holding this filter up in front of the sun, we see a very nice greenish image of the sun, which is of the proper intensity and one can observe safely.
And for the partial eclipse shots, you can use filters made specially for telescopes, and they just fit over the end of the telescope and don't allow the harmful rays to come in. Now, there aren't any special harmful rays emanating from an eclipse. it's just the sun is always dangerous to look at, isn't that right?
That's right. That's a myth that has grown up around eclipses. The moon or the sun doesn't give off any special harmful radiation during an eclipse. The reason why it is dangerous to look at the sun during a partial eclipse is exactly the same reason as it's dangerous to look at the sun for prolonged periods every day. It's simply that people's attention is drawn to the sun during eclipse, and one tries to devise strange ways of looking at it safely. Generally, they're not very safe.
Well, we've certainly been talking about totality because that's the reason that you travel across the world to see a total eclipse. There's some interesting phenomena, Michael, that one can see during totality. Could you tell us about that?
Well, of course, the first thing and the primary thing that people go to observe is the corona, and that is the faint outer atmosphere of the sun, which seems to extend during the totality phase outwards from the sun. There's a black hole in the sky where the moon covers the bright surface of the sun, and we see the corona, which is absolutely beautiful and breathtaking in its beauty, and one can see only during a total eclipse. As well, of course, during a total eclipse, the sky brightness diminishes markedly to a point where it is similar to the illumination on a fully moonlit night, so the sky gets extremely dark. We have a photograph that shows one of the other phenomena, and that is the so-called sunset colors. Around the horizon during a total eclipse of the sun, one sees beautiful sunset colors. We're actually looking at that portion of the atmosphere which is outside the shadow which is cast by the totally eclipsed sun. So that is another phenomenon. Something else one can observe is the shadow of the moon actually approaching from space and then receding at a very great speed of several thousand kilometers per hour. There is another photograph that we have here of another very interesting phenomenon called the shadow bands. And you remarked that you observed shadow bands, and I think you and Betty were the only ones to observe shadow bands at the November eclipse. They are atmospheric rippling phenomena caused just before or occurring just before and after the total phase, which are shadows which appear to pass very rapidly across any bright surface. And this is an actual drawing of
They really look like waves on the bottom of a swimming pool, if you can imagine that, just along a white surface on the ground. Very, very eerie.
Well, as I say, you observe those. I didn't happen to see them, and they're they're fairly rare, but they are very interesting to see. What one also tries to observe is the so-called diamond ring effect. In the few seconds before the total phase, the corona becomes visible as a faint band surrounding the darkened moon, and there's still a tiny diamond-like brilliant point of sunlight left, producing an effect which is called the diamond ring, and we'll see photographs of those as well. As well, because the sky becomes fairly dark, or can become dark depending on the kind of eclipse it is and the length of totality, one can see the brighter stars and occasionally bright planets as well during those few brief moments of totality. And finally, there are other effects. For example, animals are fooled into thinking that it's nighttime, and birds go into roost, and animals go to sleep, and so on. And then, of course, chickens burst from their chicken coops when the sun returns and
very
when
short
totality is
night.
over. Extremely short.
Well, one of our main interests is photographing total eclipses of the sun, and behind us we have a telescope which can be used to photograph the sun, and actually this is the telescope that we used to photograph this particular eclipse. Not very big, this is a rather expensive one, but it certainly shows, Michael, that you don't need really a lot of equipment to take photographs. Really, any camera can be used.
Any camera with any kind of lens. If one uses a longer telephoto lens, one gets a nice big image of the sun. This is the instrument that you used, and it can be packed in a suitcase and carted very conveniently even to far corners of the world like Papua New Guinea.
Well, we're going to see some photographs in a few minutes, but we do have one slide of a trick photograph, and that is you can see the stages of an eclipse through partial phases and then totality on one slide. And this was taken several years ago. Basically, the camera is on the tripod, and you see the individual phases of totality, the moon getting smaller and smaller until in the middle we have totality, and then afterwards the moon's moving off to the left there, and you get more and more of the sun shown. So that's a very graphic example of what a total eclipse sequence is like. The main thing, I think, Michael, and it's difficult to impress on someone, but the camera really lies. You really can't photograph a total eclipse properly. And in the next photograph we have a rendition of a drawing that was taken, or a drawing that was drawn earlier in the 1900s of a total eclipse. And really, this is what it looks like to the eye. There's so many different variations in brightness of the corona. Everything can be seen at the same time.
Well, that's one of the problems, as you point out, with photography. The camera cannot record the wealth of detail that can be seen with the naked eye. And although one can get photographs that give a fairly good representation of certain phases of it, it is only actually witnessing an eclipse with the naked eye that one really appreciates the extraordinary beauty and all the phenomenon.
Well, as we said at the beginning, November 23rd was the total eclipse, and 5 of us went to Papua New Guinea, a very small part of Papua New Guinea, a village called Hula, and we have a slide of the path of the eclipse to show you exactly where it went. This slide will show that New Guinea is situated just north of Australia. The eclipse was a very early morning eclipse. It was very early in the path across the Earth, and we had a 7:30 slide.
One of the unusual things about this particular eclipse is that most of the path of totality within which the sun could be seen totally eclipsed was over water. And as you pointed out, it was only a very small portion of land on a sort of a small headland on Papua New Guinea from which it was visible from land.
Okay, let's get the first slide up. We have a series of slides to depict this eclipse. This is Hula. This is what it looked like. And I guess what we haven't talked about is that eclipse trips, you get to go to far reaches of the world to see an eclipse, but also the country. And this is what Hula looked like, houses on stilts, and just an incredible experience that unfortunately we don't have a lot of time to talk about. In the next slide, we'll see more of the eclipse, the path crossing the ocean. And excuse me, as you can see, 22nd November 1984. It was the 23rd in Papua New Guinea because of the international date line. But these, along with other eclipses, total eclipses, can be seen in this drawing. Let's go to the next slide. And what it will show is our site. It's getting ready early in the morning. Here's you, Michael, I guess describing to me what we're going to be looking at.
Well, we're looking at our eclipse predictions, determining exactly when the total phase would occur, and you can see the palm trees in the background, and it's not very far from totality at this point.
Okay, let's just move through these slides quickly, and we'll be able to see setting up here, certainly hoping that the equipment will work right at the very short period of totality.
Things are always going wrong, and we each had our difficulties, but things seem to work out finally in the end. There we are setting up equipment. This is the particular telescope that I took, and we saw the Questar that you took as well in the previous slide.
Here's some of the school children of Hula, and we had a chance to show them how to look at an eclipse safely with welder's glass using pinhole cameras, and they were very well behaved, and they all enjoyed the eclipse immensely. Well, the eclipse has started. This is a partial phase, again with a filter. It's still daylight out. We're only about an hour away from totality here, and in our next eclipse shot, we'll see that the partial phase is advancing to, I guess this is only a few minutes before totality, Michael, and at this point the real excitement starts, and it gets a bit darker, and totality is only a few minutes away.
Well, that's right. It's difficult to describe the atmosphere that surrounds totality as it approaches, and we then get now to the point where just a few seconds before actual totality starts, we get the so-called diamond ring effect. And here we see it. We see the inner corona, which is surrounding the dark disk of the moon, and then on the left portion, we see still an uneclipsed portion of the sun, which is coming through very brilliantly through the valleys on the edge of the moon, and that produces a so-called diamond ring. You can also see a couple of pink prominences on the upper right, which are what we described earlier, and a little bit of the red or pinkish chromosphere, the outer shell of the sun. A beautiful photograph.
And so this is the first photograph without a filter. The filters are off, and the totality's just starting.
That's right.
Okay, the next photograph will show the chromosphere more brilliantly. I guess it'll just be after the diamond ring is over. And what are we talking about for people who use cameras, Michael? What exposures are we using here?
Well, here we were generally using either Kodachrome 64 film or a fairly low-speed Ektachrome film, and you're really talking about exposures of about a 250th or 125th of a second.
So we're talking about brightness is about as bright as the full moon?
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's take a look at the next photo. I guess this is right into totality now. And with a very, very short exposure, you get the very bright prominences, which again are hydrogen gas flaring up off the sun, which the sun is doing all the time. And the interesting thing is you don't know how many prominences you're going to see from eclipse to eclipse.
That's right, and they change at every eclipse. One of the things that we should make a point about this eclipse is that the total phase was exceedingly short. It lasted only 51 seconds as seen from our site. We therefore had to get all our photographs done during that 51 seconds and make all our observations, and it seemed, as you remember, that it was over even before it started.
And it's very fast, very fast. So the next photo is a bit of a longer exposure, and you begin to see a bit of the corona. And this is certainly, it's visible all the time, but you have to vary your exposures to get all the different aspects on film. Again, the eye can see what the camera can't.
Exactly, and what this shows is that the brightness of the corona diminishes very quickly as you move out from the edge of the sun. A slightly longer exposure here shows a little more corona, and as we get further along, we get more and more corona as we lengthen the exposures with our cameras.
So let's look at the next one, which should show us that more corona, because again of the longer exposure, and now the corona is filling the full frame.
One of the really exciting things about this eclipse, and something we really didn't expect, was that there was a great deal of structure in the corona. The corona did not appear to be evenly round around the darkened moon. Rather, it appeared to have long streamers going out from the equator, and then those little polar brushes that you can see sort of at 11 o'clock at the upper left corner of the photograph and in the lower right. And that made just an extraordinary visual sight. We're really quite pleased with these photographs.
I think, Michael, the next shot is a view with a different type of camera. Not as much magnification, but if we get that slide up, you'll see that the corona really extends a few lunar diameters out to the edge of the frame.
Well, you can see again the streamers that we were talking about a moment ago. There's a streamer there at about 2 o'clock that goes very far out. One of the points we should also make is that on the original slide, which does not duplicate properly on television, the corona goes out almost to the edge of the frame. And even the photograph doesn't show what one sees with the naked eye because it goes out much further.
Yeah, I remember with the naked eye, you could see it out 5 lunar diameters. It's just a huge, huge object in the sky, which I guess for first-time viewers is the surprising thing. It's much, much bigger when you see it in real light.
Well, it really is, and you and I have both seen several eclipses now, and I think it surprised even us.
But the next slide should show another shot of the corona. And this was taken with a smaller telescope. This was taken by Betty Robinson using a small spotting telescope, which is just like any telescope you can use to spot birds or whatever. Small equipment and an extraordinary result. The next photo is taken with the same equipment, and it shows just the instant before the diamond ring appears on the other side. All along this period of time, the moon is slowly moving from right to left, and in the next shot, we should have what's called the third contact just breaking through. Very nice shot. I'm very pleased to say I took this shot. But you can see the chromosphere and the photosphere and the beads of light signaling the end of totality, the onset of daylight again. The next shot is one of Michael's, a beautiful shot showing again the diamond ring broken in half just by a lunar mountain there. And I guess the next shot will show us that the eclipse is over, filters back on, champagne was broken out, and the next shot shows all too soon, an hour and a half later, the last portion of the moon moving off the sun. And of course the next shot is a traditional shot for eclipse expeditions. The next slide will show the victory, everyone standing together with our 2 hosts, Henry and Paula, who were the schoolmasters of the school where we stayed, all very happy and thrilled. Michael, let's in the last minute here talk about future eclipses. We have a slide which shows North America as will for the next 10-20 years for solar eclipses. When is the next good eclipse if somebody wants to get up and go see one of these things?
Well, the next total solar eclipse for people in North America really is quite a long way away. We really don't have that many in the next decade. In fact, it is that dark band that passes across the Pacific Ocean, then crosses Mexico and Central America into South America, and the date there may be a little difficult to read, is July 11th, 1991. So we have 7 years to wait for a total eclipse of the sun on this hemisphere. There are other eclipses. For example, one sees in the upper right crossing Finland and Siberia a year earlier in 1990, and there also was an eclipse in 1988 in Malaysia.
The next really good solar eclipse for Toronto will be in 1994, when we'll actually get to see an annular eclipse. Well, I'm joined now by Bob May, good friend and eclipse watcher. Bob has seen 4 total and 1 annular eclipse. And Bob, Why all the eclipses? Why do you travel so far to see them?
Well, I found one good reason for, or should I say an excuse for traveling to see different eclipses. I can never accomplish what I want to on each separate eclipse, that is photographically and visually. There's always something more to see, and there's always a higher goal to reach for photographically. It's very difficult to try and emulate some of the superb pictures that you see in astronomy and sky and telescope magazines, and not only that, it provides a wonderful opportunity to see other parts of the world.
Well, you've got a couple photos that you took in Hula. Let's take a look at the first one and describe how you took it.
I used a Questar, which is a small portable telescope such as the one that we have behind us here, and I used a Kodachrome 64 and a Canon camera. The point to try and accomplish here was to hit exactly the point that the moon's surface, moon rather, covered the sun's surface, to get this diamond ring effect, which is something that's much sought after. This particular slide now is demonstrating prominences that occur when the moon completely covers the face of the sun, and that again is something that can be quite spectacular.
Well, you've seen 4 total eclipses. How do they vary? What are the remarkable differences that you've seen?
One difference, of course, is that they each occur in different parts of the world, and consequently you're subject to different climatic conditions. The first one that I went to was in Gimli, Manitoba in 1979, and that was in snow. We were wearing winter clothing. The next one that I saw was in Kenya, and that was under an equatorial sun, which was, again, completely different. Another aspect that is different, of course, is the coronal streamers vary from eclipse to eclipse. The last one that we saw, for instance, in Papua New Guinea had very long solar streamers emanating from the equatorial regions of the sun, and the corona showed considerable flattening at the poles as a result of it being at the end of the sunspot cycle.
Bob, thanks very much.
Thank you, Randy.
Bob May, Michael Watson, for joining us. We'll see you next time on Astronomy Toronto.